Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States with another segment in the decade of the 1850s. We left off last time with the death of Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos, a German-born Redemptorist missionary priest, died in New Orleans of yellow fever on October 4th, 1867. His shrine in New Orleans, which is St. Mary's Assumption Church, where he was serving, contains his relics. There's his coffin is there. There's a lock of his hair. There's a piece of his vertebrae is there in a reliquary. Anyway, so rewinding now to 1852. May 9th through May 20th was the first Plenary Council of Baltimore, meaning the first full meeting of all the bishops in the United States at Baltimore. This is distinct from the provincial synods of Baltimore, which had happened previously. This was all the bishops and a few of the religious superiors in the United States. So sort of orient ourselves here. So I found a map that was clearer, as it doesn't have all the topographical features. So you see Maryland over here. Now this map only has Annapolis, Maryland on it because that's the capital, but Baltimore is in that state. Maryland, so to orient yourselves there. The host, who was also appointed the apostolic delegate, was the Archbishop of Baltimore, a guy we've met many times, Francis Patrick Kenrick. Attendance included 6 archbishops, 36 bishops, including the Bishop of Monterey, whom we met in a previous episode, from the newly acquired or newly conquered territory of California. There were also 8 religious superiors. It generated 25 decrees and a pastoral letter published on Ascension, then it was Ascension Thursday, 1852. And the letter consisted of 15 numbered sections. As far as the decrees, Decree 3, sacred ceremonies were not to be used in the burial of Catholics whose bodies were interred in sectarian cemeteries or public cemeteries if Catholic cemeteries were at hand. So, if an area did have a Catholic cemetery, but a Catholic chose to be buried in a cemetery belonging to another religion or just a public cemetery, then the priests were prohibited from doing the ritual of the rite of committal and final commendation. Decree number 6, bishops were exhorted to choose consultors from among the clergy of their diocese and to ask their advice in the government of the diocese. A monthly meeting of these consultors with the bishop to discuss diocesan affairs was termed praiseworthy. So seminarians, by this point you've had your canon law classes, so exhorted and praiseworthy means it's not mandatory, at least not yet. Decree number 7, a chancellor should be constituted in every diocese for the easier and more orderly transaction of business. So again, seminarians, you should have had this already, but canonically, in canon law, a chancellor of a diocese is the official record keeper. And when a bishop dies or is transferred, the chancellor is the only one of the curial offices that remains constant. The others are become contingent. Some just disappear, like the vicar general, anything with a vicar in front of it. Vicar for clergy, ecclesiastical, all that just disappears because canonically vicarius means one who exercises authority in the name of another. And so if that other, the bishop, is gone for whatever reason, either through death or transfer, then the source of that authority disappears also. But the chancellor is an ordinary office. Now the next bishop can appoint a new chancellor, or continue the one that he inherits. But the chancellor is the official record keeper. Skipping down, decree number 11. After the following Easter, the following would go into effect: that matrimonial bans must be published, and bishops should only dispense that for grave reasons. Okay, so ban. This is B-A-N-N. I know it doesn't sound right. A ban, we think of as prohibiting, so matrimonial prohibition, but that's not. Think of this in this case, ban like banner. They weren't literally put, but like an announcement. So it should be announced for 3 weeks in a row. That John Smith and Jane Jones were going to be married, or going to be married in this church on this day. So that if anyone, knows any reason that should not happen, they have time to make that known, to intervene. And the bishop should only dispense that for grave reasons, which means it can be dispensed. The bishop could dispense it, but he would have to have a grave reason. Decree number 12, pastors of parishes should teach or see that Christian doctrine is taught to, as the decree phrases it, to the young and the ignorant. Decree 13, bishops are exhorted to have a Catholic school in every parish. That's the influence of Bishop Neumann from Philadelphia there. And teachers should be paid from the parochial funds. Okay, seminarians, paying attention there. So exhorted, that means not required, to have a Catholic school in every parish. And the teachers should be paid from the parochial funds. Okay, seminarians, you understand the implications there. Parochial, parochus is the Latin for parish, so that it be paid from the parish funds, not the diocesan funds. You see, the bishop is exhorted to see that every parish has a school, but the teachers in the schools would be paid by the parish, not by the diocese. So, Decree 14, an ecclesiastical seminary should be erected in each province. Notice should, so not mandatory. Decree 15, the bishops or their delegates should demand every year an account of the administration of church funds from those who administer those funds, whether laymen or clerics. So this is the annual financial report, seminarians, that once you're pastors or in charge of any ministry of the diocese, or more likely both, when you're a pastor of a parish, plus you have a few other jobs. At each of those, there's an annual financial report. Notice, should demand. All right, so demand. Like if it just said demand, then it's okay, then it's required. But should demand. So this is something else that the bishop can waive for whatever reason. But I'm not aware of any bishops who do. So, no. Decree 16: laymen are not to take part and not to take any part in the administration of church affairs without the free consent of the bishop. If they usurp any such authority and divert church goods to their own use, or in any way frustrate the will of the donors, or if they, even under cover of the civil law, endeavor to wrest from the bishop's hands what has been confided to his care, then such laymen, by that very fact, fall under the censures constituted by the Council of Trent against usurpers of ecclesiastical goods. Okay, so this is trusteeism. This is, and we covered that earlier. I think I have a whole video earlier in this playlist on trusteeism, so you can refresh your memories there. But this is the first official meeting of all the bishops of the country. They're just putting in there that, so it's not saying laymen cannot participate in the administration of church affairs, just that they cannot do so without the consent of the bishop. And the whole thing about property, that was the, and even civil law, because in the American system, corporations are chartered by states. So, and each state has its own nuances about corporate law. And as we saw, that there were some of the trustees in some parishes in some states, very early in our history, were using the law against the church. Decree 17. When the title to a church is in the bishop's name, pastors are warned not to appoint trustees or to permit trustees to be elected without the bishop's authority. Again, that's trusteeism, a response to it. Skipping Decree 19. Bishops should use their influence with the civil authorities to prevent anyone in the Army or Navy from being obliged to attend a religious service repugnant to his conscience. So this is the Catholic Protestant thing again. Okay. Okay. Now, okay. That's it. You can find these things online. I don't read all of them. I think that's you get the point. So they're just bringing order, establishing policies for the particular circumstances of the United States. Where the laws are written with the idea of separation of church and state, that it's officially a secular republic, but acknowledging that at this period in the mid-19th century, the governing establishment, all three branches of government in all states, were numerically dominated by Protestants. Okay. In the same year, 1852, we find another historical snapshot of slavery as practiced in the United States. It's leading up to, so this is 9 years before the Civil War. And I think we've alluded to this guy before, but now we're formally introduced to Frederick Douglass. And that's Douglass with two S's at the end. He was born a slave as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey near Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. By his own account, he didn't know the exact date of his birth or even the year, but he said he deduced that it was 1817 or 1818. As a young boy, still a slave, he was sent to Baltimore to be trained as a house servant, which meant that he would have a longer lifespan than the field servants who generally did not live long. And there, as a house slave, he was taught to read and write. In 1838, he escaped from slavery, went north to New York City, where he met and married a lady named Anna Murray. She was, as they described it then, a free woman of color. Soon thereafter, he changed his name to Frederick Douglass, Douglass. And that's the way history knows him. In 1841, he addressed a convention of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Now, we met them earlier, William Lloyd Garrison. We even read an excerpt of the platform of that society. He addressed the meeting was held in Nantucket, and he so greatly impressed the group that they immediately employed him as an agent, a public speaker, to promote the cause of abolitionism, which naturally was a cause that Frederick Douglass, as an escaped slave, would have affinity with. He was such an impressive speaker. He was so articulate that many people doubted that he had ever been a slave, as typically slaves were not given that much literacy. So he wrote a book titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It was his autobiography, which you can read. It's free online, so read it at your leisure. It's worth reading. Fast forwarding a bit, during the Civil War, he assisted in recruiting what were then called men of color to serve in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments. And, of course, he consistently argued for the immediate emancipation of slaves. After the war, when that did happen, in 1865, finally, when the Constitution was amended to outlaw slavery, he involved himself in securing and promoting and protecting the rights of the newly freed slaves. In his later years, at different times, he was employed by the government. One of his jobs, he served as a secretary to the Santo Domingo Commission, which is what they were calling it, but that was when dealing with Haiti. So after the successful Haitian slave uprising, they created their own country, and the United States for a time did not recognize it. And so this commission was appointed by our government to interact with the Haitian government to create formal diplomatic relations. Further, he was appointed a recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital. And then later, when the Santo Domingo Commission, to which he was secretary, succeeded in establishing full diplomatic relations with Haiti, then Frederick Douglass was appointed U.S. Minister to Haiti, which was the term they were using for ambassadors then. His other works include one titled My Bondage and My Freedom, and a third titled Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. The first published in 1855. The first was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Then the second was My Bondage and My Freedom, which was published in 1855. The third, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, published in 1881. And he died in 1895. So, rewinding a bit, in 1845, his first work, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was a major influence on the debate into the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War. Now, an unforeseen, circumstance of this is by publishing his autobiography and confessing to having run away. Once the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted as part of the California Compromise, then the slave owners could demand the federal government capture him, arrest him, and bring him back to be enslaved again. So he fled. He had to flee the United States for a time, but he kept in touch with abolitionists that he had befriended in the United States. So some English Quaker friends raised money to allow him to purchase his freedom from his former owners, so he could return to the United States legally as a free person and not subject to the fugitive slave law. When he returned, settled in Rochester, New York, and he published a newspaper titled The North Star. And he helped in various ways, as part of the Underground Railroad, helped escaped slaves get to Canada, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law. On the 4th of July, 1852, which is why I put him here in our chronology, he was invited to give a speech in Rochester, on Independence Day. So he delivered what turned out to be an indictment, a stinging indictment of a nation celebrating freedom and independence while keeping slaves. Now, it's a very long address. It's worth reading in full, but I'll just give you an excerpt. Quote, "Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. My subject, then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its proper characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your shouts of liberty and equality are hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. For revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. Okay, that's an excerpt, but obviously you get the message. This goes much longer, but that's okay. That's what he said. So, 1852 is an election year, which introduces us to President number 14, Franklin Pierce, and his Vice President, William King. Franklin Pierce was born in 1804 in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, a lifelong Democrat. Let's see. I should put... Okay, you see New Hampshire up there. No, it doesn't have Hillsborough on the map, but it has Concord as the capital. Born in New Hampshire, a lifelong Democrat, which, remember, in this context, mid-19th century, that means the states' rights, strong states' rights ideology, and a weak federal government ideology. He served in the House of Representatives from 1833 to 1837, and served in the Senate from 1837 to 42. He served in the Army during the Mexican War, 1846 to 48. Pierce was nominated by the Democrats as a compromise candidate in the presidential election of 1852. Since he was a Northerner by birth who owned no slaves, but he did support states' rights, even if a state invoked those rights to retain slavery. He signed the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854, which we will discuss in due course, that facilitated expansion of slavery into the new territories. And he secured a treaty in 1854, Treaty of Kanagawa, with Japan, opening Japanese ports to U.S. Well, not all of them, but it did open designated ports on the islands of Japan to U.S. trade. He was nominated for a second term and publicly opposed by President Lincoln. Not Lincoln. He was nominated for a second term. Once the Civil War took place, he was not president, and he publicly opposed President Lincoln's conduct during the Civil War. Before we get to all of that, coincident in time, there was an event that triggered a series of events within church history that brings together many of the threads we've been discussing. The Know Nothing movement, the virulent anti-Catholicism that's just been part of the DNA of the Republic since our course began, and public violence, urban violence. Okay, this was the visit of Cardinal Gaetano Bedini. That's Gaetano, Gaetano, and Bedini, Bedini. He lived from 1806 to 1864. The visit in question took place from June 30th, 1853, to February 3rd, 1854. Okay, so you have those dates now. Background. The Know Nothing Alliance of social reformers and xenophobes was joined by militant anti-Catholics, owing to the national publicity received by the first visit of a Roman Catholic cardinal to the United States. Cardinal Bedini had a past which was taken out of context and exploited by the anti-Catholic press. During the Revolution of 1848 in Italy, Pope Pius IX and many others, including Bedini, were driven into exile in Naples, and they stayed in exile. They couldn't go back to Rome for 2 more years, and they were only able to go back to Rome because the army of Catholic Austria invaded the papal state to crush the revolution, which, like all those other revolutions we covered in previous sessions, were not just anti-Catholic, but anti-religious. The following year, in 1849, Bedini was appointed papal legate to the important region of the Romagna. That's on the eastern side of the Apennine Mountains, on the Adriatic side of Italy. As legate, Bedini was the governor, civil governor, in the Romagna. But because of the circumstances of the revolution, real power was exercised by the Austrian troops that had come into the papal state and put down the revolution. In Bologna, one of the cities of the Romagna, also home to a historic university, the Austrians conducted public executions of revolutionaries as a deterrent to further anarchism. One of those condemned and executed was a Barnabite priest named Ugo, U-G-O, Bassi, B-A-S-S-I. 3 years later, in 1852, Bedini was appointed apostolic nuncio to Brazil. Nuncio is just ambassador. He was ordered to go to his new assignment through the United States. The cover story was that he was on his way to a new post and he wished to see the growth of the American Catholic Church in this new republic just to satisfy his personal curiosity. That was the cover story. Since the United States at this period did not recognize the Holy See as a sovereignty, there were no diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the United States. There was no papal nuncio in the United States at the time. In fact, there would not be a full nuncio, one with full diplomatic relations, until Ronald Reagan was president. So that was all the cover story. Bedini's real mission, communicated to him privately, verbally, behind closed doors, was to make a tour of the major sees in the country for the purpose of, first, investigating the ecclesiological problem of trusteeism, which was facilitated by the way American law was written at the time. And second, to provide Rome a first-hand account of the situation of the Catholic Church in this new thing, this new republic, which was officially secular, but which Rome viewed as just a Protestant republic. All of this might have gone smoothly, as the cover story was one designed to stroke the American ego. You know, he's just coming to see how great we are. However, an embittered ex-revolutionary Italian priest named Alessandro Gavazzi, G-A-V-A-Z-Z-I, arrived weeks before Bedini and made contact with the American press, the Protestant anti-Catholic American press, in order to avenge his comrades executed 3 years earlier, including the Barnabite priest Ugo Bassi. The newspapers devoured Gavazzi's story, and Protestant organizations sponsored a lecture tour for him with interpreters. Gavazzi characterized the Italian revolutions in 1848 as the effort of the oppressed seeking liberty from the papal monarchy, just as the founding fathers of the United States freed the colonies from the British monarchy. Gavazzi told the story of a savage suppression by the forces of the Catholic monarch of Austria, characterized Bedini as a papal assassin who was making a reconnaissance of the United States for an enemy power. The Know Nothing movement grew as a result of joining in this publicity campaign, capitalizing on it. It allowed them to rally their diffuse membership around a concrete threat: a Catholic prince representing a papal monarch with a history of tyranny and anti-democratic executions was coming to the ground of the sacred United States, and we have to do something about it. This appeal to anti-Catholic paranoia was so effective that riots took place and we'll go into detail about some of them. In cities along Bedini's itinerary, and against, the placards would read, "The Butcher of Bologna." In Alabama, for example, local know-nothings kidnapped and tortured Jesuit priest serving at Spring Hill College. The municipal authorities in Mobile, Alabama, concocted charges of mismanagement of City Hospital against the Daughters of Charity and removed it from their care. But the worst of the Bedini riots, in terms of the number of people involved, the number of people killed, took place in Cincinnati, Ohio, in December of 1853. An armed mob of about 500 German men, along with 100 women, marched on the home of Bishop John Purcell of Cincinnati, protesting the visit of Bedini. Because the cover story was that Bedini was going to visit all these bishops, so Purcell was going to host when Bedini came to Cincinnati. So these are protesters, who wanted Purcell to withdraw the invitation and tell Bedini he couldn't come. In the first of these protests, one protester was killed and 60 more were arrested. At the time of Cardinal Bedini's visit, anti-Catholic feelings were very pronounced in Cincinnati. Archbishop Purcell had alienated many by objecting to Catholics paying taxes to support the public schools. Hearing of Bedini's visit, one of the newspapers, the Daily Commercial, printed a very unfavorable article in English, and the German language, the Freeman's Hochwächter, translated it and printed it in for the German immigrants who were, in Cincinnati and had not yet learned English. Now the German population in Cincinnati some were Catholic, of course, but there were also many Protestants. So the Hochwächter started printing scurrilous articles in German, repeating, calling him the butcher, Bedini, calling him the Butcher of Bologna. The know-nothing groups singled out Bedini as a convenient target for attack. The German in Cincinnati, the way they, in the parlance of the day, there were German 48ers in Cincinnati who were in full support of the nativists of the time. They were, for the most part, either Protestants or more of them were atheists, because they participated in a distinct number of revolutions in Germany, also in 1848, all of which were suppressed. So they fled to avoid incarceration or execution in Germany. So those are the German 48ers, definitely not Catholic, and if anything, openly anti-Catholic. However, in Cincinnati, they also had the Third Years, as they were called, the Germans, the Third Years, those who had left Germany in the decade of the 1830s to escape political repression, and specifically oppression against their religion. So the 30 Years were mostly Catholic Germans. On the day of Bedini's arrival, the Hochwächter, the German language newspaper, published an article accusing Bedini of torture and murder of the priest Ugo Bassi, demanding the Cardinal's assassination in revenge, appealing specifically to the Society of Freemen, which was a know-nothing organization specifically in Cincinnati. 1,200 men gathered in the over-the-Rhine section of the city. That was just that was a nickname, a local nickname for the German section of the city. On Christmas Day, Bedini he arrived and he preached in French and in German at St. Peter's Cathedral. Meanwhile, the Freimauner, the Society of Freemen, or the Cincinnati Know-Nothings, called a meeting in the morning to prepare for a demonstration against Bedini, a protest, inviting other groups, and spent the afternoon making effigies to burn, banners and placards. The mayor of Cincinnati was informed that this was going to happen, and he ordered the chief of police, Captain Thomas Lukens, to investigate. Certain that there would be no trouble on Christmas Day, the mayor went home to his family. Soon after, Captain Lukens heard that the march had started. Even on Christmas Day, they were going to spend their time doing this. So he ordered 100 policemen back to duty and posted them outside of the bishop's chancery, which was next to the cathedral. So they were simultaneously protecting both buildings. So the protest began soon after 10 with over 500 men led by a drum section, followed by 100 women. In addition to banners and placards, several of the men carried a wooden scaffold from which was hanging an effigy of the Cardinal. When the police advanced to meet the demonstrators, one of the protesters, fired a shot. And then the police charged. And there was just a brawl ensued in which 2 policemen and 15 of the anti-Catholic demonstrators were wounded, and one of them was killed. Another 60 of the protesters were arrested. So lives were lost, So the law had to get involved. At least, the theater, the appearance of law. So the legal proceedings that followed were entirely biased against the Catholics. After the police, after some of the police testified, the prosecuting attorney said that no proof had been given that there had ever been intent to do violence against the Cardinal. So his effigy hanging, from a scaffold, that wasn't enough. So the court dismissed the indictment, dismissed the charges, on the basis that the case, that there was, insufficient evidence to prove the underlying crime. Since the entire purpose of the cover story, Bedini's cover story, had been to avoid attention, Bedini then moved around in disguise, canceled the rest of the trip. The bishops got him to Staten Island, New York, put him on a ship to leave the country for good. This entire farce confirmed in the mind of the Vatican officials that the United States was a place entirely under the control of Protestants, anti-Catholic Protestants, despite its official legal pretense of separation of church and state. Chronologically, the next episode brings us to the Washington Monument, which was not built yet, but it was in process. To facilitate that, there was a civic organization called the Washington National Monument Society. It took as its patriotic duty soliciting funds from across the country to construct a monument to the first U.S. president, George Washington, that would be set up on the western end of the Capitol Mall. By the 1850s, they formulated an additional publicity campaign, phrased in these words: with a view of having the states of the Union properly represented in the monument, this society extends an invitation for each state to furnish for insertion in the interior walls a block of marble or other durable stone, a production of its soil, of the following dimensions: 4 feet long, 2 feet high, with a bed of from 12 to 18 inches. The name of the state is to be cut thereon in large letters, and, if desirable to the donor, the state's coat of arms also. Later, that's the advertisement. And later, this invitation, the wording was adjusted slightly. They also extended an invitation to foreign countries to contribute a stone with the name of the country on it to put in the monument. So Pope Pius X, as the ruler of the Papal States, accepted the invitation. He had a black marble block measuring about 3 feet long, 18 inches high, 10 inches deep, removed from the ruins of the ancient Temple of Concord on the western side of the Forum in Rome. He had the simple phrase, "Rome to America," inscribed on the stone, and sent it across the ocean. It arrived in the United States in October of 1853. News of the intended gift from the papacy to the United States generated much hostile anti-Catholic sentiment before the marble block ever reached Washington. For example, in 1852, an anti-Catholic pamphlet was published by a guy named John Weishaupt, Weishampel. The pamphlet was titled, "Rome to America, the Pope's Stratagem." Subtitle, "An Address to the Protestants of the United States against placing the Pope's block of marble in the Washington Monument." In the pamphlet, Weishaupt argued that the increased immigration into the country of Catholics, Irish and German Catholics and Italians and Poles, that this was a cover, that the Pope was deliberately sending them here, pretending that they were fleeing some kind of persecution. But once they obtained the numerical advantage, then they would use the vote to take over the government and erase the republic, and then turn it into a benighted medieval Catholic monarchy. So we've seen this. This goes back to what's his name, Morse, and other guys in the 1830s. The Pope's stone. So emotion was being stoked here. So the Pope's stone, together with other blocks from other countries, was stored in a shed. The shed was called the Lapidarium. It was near the base of where the obelisk would be built. By that time, the base of the obelisk, the construction had begun, and it was 153 feet. And then it happened, the reason I'm talking about this. Early in the morning on March 5th, 1854, a band of vigilantes, obviously know-nothings of some variation, affiliated with them or at least sympathetic to them, broke into the warehouse and stole the Pope's stone, which was never recovered. So since this is a government monument, as government property, and it was a crime, it had to be investigated. So here is an excerpt from the serial set volume 4436, number 21, an investigation commissioned by the 57th Congress. The report was made in the second session. This is an excerpt of the report. Quote, "A deed of barbarism was enacted on Monday morning last, between 1 and 2 o'clock, by several persons, number not known, but supposed to be from 4 to 10, which will be considered as belonging rather to some of the centuries considerably in our rear than to the better half of the boasted 19th century. We refer to the forcible seizure from its place of deposit in a shed at the Washington Monument of a block of marble sent hither from Rome, a tribute to the memory of Washington by the pontiff and intended to become a part of the edifice now erecting to signalize his name and glory. It originally stood in the Temple of Concord in Rome, was of beautiful texture, and had for its dimensions a length of 3 feet, a height of 18 inches, and thickness of 10 inches. The account we hear of the matter is this, that at about the time above mentioned, several men suddenly surrounded the watchbox of the night watchman, and passed a cord, such as is used for clotheslines, around the box, and piled stones against the door, calling to the man within that if he kept quiet, he would not be injured. At the same time, they pasted pieces of newspapers on the 2 or 3 window openings that commanded the particular shed containing the fated block, so as to prevent the watchmen from seeing their operations. They then removed one of the stripes in front of the place where the block stood, and passing in and out by the opening, carried it off by placing it on a handcart used about the premises. There is no doubt that they took the block to the riverside, the Potomac River, no less than a quarter of a mile off, and pitched it over the steep bank upon the river beach, where they enjoyed a favorable opportunity of breaking it up undiscovered or boating it off into the river, which they probably did after defacing it. All this went on, it seems, without effective remonstrance from the watchman, although he had with him a double-barrel shotgun loaded with buckshot, and the operations at the shed were within easy shot. As for the pasting on the windows, there was nothing in that, for they slid up and down like the sashes of an omnibus. These proceedings, the watchman says, took place about 1:30, but he gave no notice of it to the family residing at the monument until 4. For these and other similar reasons, he has been suspended. So a meeting of the Society, the Washington Monument Society, was held on March 7th in reference to the vandalism, and it was resolved to offer a reward for discovery of the perpetrators. Accordingly, the following advertisement appeared in the newspaper Daily National Intelligencer on March 8th. Quote, $100 reward. The Board of Managers of the Washington National Monument Society will pay the above reward of $100 for the arrest and conviction of the person or persons who, on the night of the 5th, stole and destroyed a block of marble contributed to said monument. End quote. This advertisement availed nothing as to the discovery of the guilty persons. It was understood to have been the work of persons belonging to the Know-Nothings, as one of their professions was being opposition to the Catholic Church. From the time of the that's enough. You get the point. Okay, yeah, that's enough. 1854, May 30th, the Kansas Nebraska Act. Okay. This is another step towards the Civil War. The event which gave the Know Nothing movement its final injection of supporters was the Kansas Nebraska Act, signed by President number 14, Franklin Pierce, on May 30th, 1854. The background. The Kansas Nebraska Act was motivated by the desire to facilitate the expansion of the railroads into the West. It is also the reason, or one of the reasons, why so many assert that the real cause of the Civil War was states' rights. Let's see. I'll do this first. Let's see if you can see this. No, I'm going to do this. Okay, so Kansas and Nebraska. See that? in that territory, it was not only a approximate trigger for the Civil War, but in the territory there was actually a proto-Civil War that took place. I mean, full-scale battles, as we'll see. Okay, the background of all of this. Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglass, lived from 1813 to 1861. He was born in Vermont, but he's one of those that moved to another state, in his case Illinois, and made his life and profession there. He's the one who moved in Congress the Kansas Nebraska Act in order to transition the Kansas Nebraska region into the territory statehood pipeline, for that procedure. According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes north, which is the border of Missouri, was the boundary between the slave region to the south and free region to the north. Extending that line west to the Pacific would leave most of Kansas and all of Nebraska on the free side of the line. Senator Douglass included in the Kansas Nebraska Act wording a provision for popular sovereignty within the territories as they petitioned for statehood. Translating that into real, that meant that the people, the residents physically in the territory, would vote on whether they wanted the territory to allow slavery or not, even though most of the territory was on the free side of the line. This provision, therefore, de facto, had the effect of waiving the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Abolitionists were outraged because this opened the possibility of slavery on the northern side of the line. Southerners were worried because the western economy, the territories, Kansas, Nebraska, all the way over to California, that the topography did not lend itself to plantations. And therefore the economy of that region was not developing as plantations. And therefore they had no reason to have slaves. In addition, the emerging ethos of the region politically was populist, favoring small farmers and ranchers who regarded slave-worked plantations as unfair market competition. So for other reasons, there were those who were there, apart from their moral beliefs, just for economic reasons, that they would oppose slavery. The provision for popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act meant that whichever side controlled the territorial government would determine if the territory would be slave or free. As according to the statehood process, a given territory had to have a certain number of people in it, and they had to create a government, a territorial government. That government had to compose a draft state constitution that would be sent to the U.S. Congress with a petition to be admitted as a state with that so constituted. The contest for control, therefore, which side would get send people into the territory to form the government to petition, that contest triggered a proto-Civil War described as Bleeding Kansas. At the time, that's not just me calling, it was at the time it was called Bleeding Kansas. As abolitionists, those against slavery, disputed two separate elections in the territory because those elections had resulted in pro-slavery victory. This proto-Civil War found its leader, its symbolic, not the only one, because it was not centralized. There were individuals on both sides forming these vigilante groups, but one whose name looms, is remembered in history, was the abolitionist whom we've met previously, John Brown. Okay, this context, along with events we've already covered, is also the background for the creation of the Republican Party as yet another third party, like the Free Soil Party, like the American Party, which was the public face of the Know-Nothings. So Bleeding Kansas took place from 1854 to 1859. The Republican Party was created on February 28th, 1854. Now, it was not created in Kansas. It was established in Ripon, R-I-P-O-N, Wisconsin, in a little white schoolhouse. That's actually what it's called. There's a historical marker there that it calls it the Little White Schoolhouse. So it was not founded in Kansas, but its membership recruiting benefited from the elevated emotional state of Bleeding Kansas and the atrocities committed. That it activated people politically who otherwise would have just gone about their lives and not been involved in politics. The Republican Party was created from the same confluence of events that fostered the Know-Nothings. The difference being that the Republican Party had a more defined agenda. As originally constituted in 1854, the Republicans were, first, abolitionist; second, federalist, meaning strong central government; third, free soil, populist; fourth, federally funded economic development, infrastructure, roads, bridges, railroads, canals. So you can see that that they were able to get recruits from the Whigs because of, their belief in the strong central government and federally funded infrastructure. They were also able to draw some of the humanitarian abolitionist types, the Garrison types, from the abolitionist, as well as abolitionist and free soil populist from the Know-Nothings, who were not comfortable with the violence, with the vigilantism against immigrants and Catholics. So the meeting in which the party came into existence took place on February 28th, 1854, in Ripon, Wisconsin. Their first presidential candidate was John Fremont of California. He lost in 1856. Their second presidential candidate was Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, who won the presidential election in 1860, becoming president number 16. He was sworn in 1861 and remained president until he was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. The first president to be assassinated. Events in the Kansas Territory contributed to the Republican Party's birth and growth and exacerbated the sectional conflict between North and South. Iowans crossed the border into Nebraska and voted in territorial elections, but their numbers were small, and Nebraska was expected to petition to be a free state. In Kansas, however, a proto-Civil War broke out between vigilantes who were pro-slavery from Missouri against settlers from free states. Problems appeared in the first territorial election. So, they were accusing each other of voter interference, election interference and election fraud. You see, there's nothing new. This is nothing new in the universe. The particular election where they started accusing each other of this was electing a delegate to go to Congress to make the petition. Then that election took place in November of 1854. The disturbances grew until they caught national attention because people were dying. In March of 1855 was an election for a territorial legislature that would compose the draft constitution for the state, for the proposed state. Those from Missouri, pro-slavery, came from across the river to vote in the territory. At polls throughout the territory, armed pro-slavery vigilantes, presumed to be from Missouri, threatened voters. At least they were accused. The abolitionists said that they were threatening and menacing voters and threatening and menacing election officials from free states to discourage abolitionist voting. The Territorial Census, which was also part of the process to apply, you had to tell Congress how many people were in the territory, had shown prior to this conflict that there were 2,905 eligible voters in the territory, meaning there were residents in the territory that could prove it. The pro-slavery candidates were elected with over 5,000 votes, even though there were only 2,905 eligible. So many of the Missourians who crossed the state line to vote did intend to settle in the state, and some of them eventually did. But many northern settlers who had gone there felt deprived of their political rights. Said, okay, is this what it's going to be? Is this what the state's going to be? We're not going to be able to vote without risking our lives. So they abandoned Kansas, but not all of them did. So the newly elected territorial legislature, was pro-slavery. So they passed a slave code for Kansas as part of composing the draft constitution. A pro-slavery newspaper publisher named Benjamin Stringfellow boasted that Kansas had slave laws as solid as any in the country. But resistance was building. Abolitionist resistance was building. There were New Englanders who had relocated to Kansas. Now the pro-slavery would say, okay, that they're doing just what they accused as they had been saying, okay, all these Missourians came in and to rig the vote, but they really weren't residents of the state, so they didn't have a right to vote. So it was voter fraud, election interference. But then the slavery side said, well, okay, now these New Englanders are doing the same thing. They don't intend to settle in Kansas. They're just going there to pad the vote, to pad the anti-slavery vote, to try to overturn the election, overturn the Kansas election. But whoever, whatever, there was a free state movement. There was a free state movement, and they also formed a vigilante group. So you have these two vigilante groups, the pro-slavery and the abolitionist vigilante groups. There were Midwesterners who moved in, and they probably did. They were going for land. They really did want to set up life there. They had as their leader, their public voice, so to speak, was a former Indiana congressman named James H. Lane, Lane. He arrived in the territory and discovered that there were Northerners and Midwesterners moving to the state who were divided over slavery. Some didn't care. Divisions among those who were anti-slavery, but they all had different reasons. Some didn't really care about the slaves themselves. They wanted to form a small homestead, and so they didn't want big plantations worked by slaves as rivals. But there were also those who opposed slavery on moral grounds, that it should just be eliminated immediately. Well, there was others who opposed it but feared immediate total emancipation. just favored a gradual emancipation. Just to say, like, pick a date and say anyone born after this date, even if their parents were slaves, that they will be free. Or something like that. But they did agree that they didn't want slavery. In September of 1855, that group, the abolitionist group, assembled in Topeka to write a constitution, another constitution, because they said that they call the bogus the one that was elected before, they called it the bogus legislature. That was elected by 5,000 votes out of 2,900 voters. So they rejected that pro-slavery code, that pro-slavery constitution. So in September of 55, they wrote what's called the Topeka, the Constitution, which was a free soil constitution. They elected a New Englander who had come to the state, a guy named Charles Robinson. They elected him as territorial governor and had him petition Congress for admission as a state, free state. Now, although many abolitionists backed this Topeka movement, it was officially not legal because there had been no judicial process that formally pronounced the earlier vote, the first vote, as being illegal. So for the next several years, free state vigilantes and pro-slave vigilantes just fought, random battles. I mean, sometimes it was triggered by a particular event, but other times they just saw each other and just started fighting. So, I mean, it was a complete breakdown of public order. Coupled with that, nationally, there was propaganda, publicity on both sides. There were Southern pro-slavery newspapers supporting the Missouri pioneers, as they called them, the pro-slavery. But then there were the Free Staters who supported the noble humanitarian abolitionist. So it stoked up emotion all around the country. The Free State governor elected by the Topeka Convention, Charles Robinson, his wife Sarah contributed to this. She became famous in her own right. She published a book titled Kansas, Its Interior and Exterior Life, which is a valuable historical source. I mean, obviously she had an agenda. I mean, she was a free soil. But still, it's an eyewitness account in which she portrayed the Free Staters like her as being consistent victims of what she called the border ruffians, which is the pro-slavery Missourians. Okay. So once the Free Soilers got solidified got themselves organized, then the pro-slavery side, then they formed the Law and Order Party. That's actually what they call themselves, the Law and Order Party. As they said, look, we had a convention, a legitimate convention, in March of '55 that elected, the people, and they produced a slave code. So Kansas is, according to the terms of the Kansas Nebraska Act, which provided for popular sovereignty, they're saying it's already been decided. Kansas is a slave state, or it's going to petition to be admitted as a slave state. So now all these people coming, the abolitionists, they're saying all these the New Englanders and all coming in, they are trying to overturn a legitimate election because they didn't like the result. So we are going to be the Law and Order Party. They were led by territorial officials, such as one we met earlier, a surveyor, John Calhoun, who was from Illinois, but he moved down to Kansas. And they seized on episodes of just gang fighting to justify acting to suppress the Free Soilers. So events during 1855, 1856 gave the Law and Order pro-slavery vigilantes their chance. An altercation occurred, a battle occurred over a land claim, a specific land claim. In the course of the fighting, a Missourian, pro-slavery Missourian, killed a free soiler. The murderer, the Missourian, fled back to Missouri. The free soilers then retaliated against the pro-slavery types, and then it became chaos. And it was hit, then counter hit, and setting a fire in somebody's barn, then hamstringing this other guy's horses, so it just went just complete chaos. There was a sheriff named Samuel Jones. He arrested the free soilers, the dead man's, the free soilers' friend, accusing him of, somehow, well, your friend got killed, so it was actually his fault, but he's dead. We can't arrest him, but you're his friend, so we're going to arrest you. Because, by association, it must be your fault, too. But then his buddies, other free soiler vigilantes, attacked the sheriff's office, attacked the jail, and broke out their guy, broke out their the brother of the free soiler who was murdered. They took him to Lawrence, the town of Lawrence, where there was set up by abolitionists, by free soilers, the New England Immigrant Aid Company. So this was set up, funded by New Englanders, many of whom had never been to Kansas and had no intention of going there, but they supported abolitionism and they wanted Kansas admitted as a free state. So they provided funds to help people who did want to actually move to Kansas and get land and set up life, but were free soilers, helping to pay their transportation cost and helping them, to put down money for a land. So Sheriff Jones called for help. He wanted a posse to go after the escaped free soiler, as well as going after the gang that broke him out. He appealed to the other governor, so to the governor, that the territorial governor that the free soilers recognized, Wilson Shannon. He was a Democrat from Ohio, activated the militia. So soon Lawrence was surrounded, and it was a war. I mean, it was a siege. I mean, this is completely forgotten in American history. Of course, it was overshadowed by the Civil War that happened after. But nothing just happens. In April of 1861, we did. Oh yeah, let's just start killing each other. That nothing just happens. There's years and years, well, you could say, over a century in the making. But this is the proximate sequence of events. Inside Lawrence. Anyway, I don't want to go to. So you get the point. There's two vigilante groups, and now they're coming together en masse around Lawrence. So there's a major battle that occurs there. All right, I'll skip all that. People died, and then more people died. Then more people died. And it was even called in the newspapers the sack of Lawrence. In this case, the pro-slavery vigilantes won, and they destroyed the free soil, the hotel where where the gang and the escape guy were, as well as in the lobby of the hotel is where the New England, the Aid Society was set up, the Abolitionist Society. So they won. They took Lawrence, captured Lawrence, and either killed those that they could capture, or others just ran away. John Brown, he re-enters the story here. Of course, he's a free soiler. He was on his way to Lawrence as it made the news. It was a siege. I mean, this was a long, so he went to Lawrence with his own vigilantes to fight for the abolitionist side. He heard he had not gotten there, and he was actually in the territory of Kansas on his way when news arrived that Lawrence had fallen to the slavery forces. He found out on May 24th. That night, Brown led a group of his own vigilantes, including 4 of his sons and 1 of his sons-in-law and 2 other men, to retaliate. And in the course of this, they ambushed and assassinated 5 pro-slavery settlers in the Padawatomi Creek region. So the pro-slavery people then call this the Padawatomi Massacre. Now, in a painful, because this was an emotion, he just found out Lawrence was sacked and people died, abolitionists died there, so he wanted to retaliate. So this was not planned. It was just an emotional outburst, which means that even though this was motivated by his desire to get rid of slavery, none of the people he killed owned slaves. And there were only a couple of hundred slaves in the entire Kansas territory. But the people killed did have connections. I mean, they favored the slavery side, even though they personally did not own slaves. One of them, who was killed, Allen Wilkinson, was a member of the territorial legislature, but the first one, which the abolitionists didn't recognize as legitimate. Another victim was a guy named James Doyle. He was murdered along with 2 of his sons. The elder, James Doyle, was an officer in the territorial court. Let's see. The other governor, we have 2 governors. So the first governor, territorial governor, Charles Robinson, he was arrested as he traveled to the east, and he was held, incarcerated, without charge, through the summer of 1856 as a prisoner with other Free Soil leaders, and they held them without trial in the territorial capital there, the pro-slavery territorial capital of Lecompton. The next year, that's how long this is going on. I mean, the next year, they finally put Robinson on trial of charges of usurping office, because he was elected by the second, by the abolitionist election, which denied the legitimacy of the first one. So it went on, and then the other governor elected, William Shannon, he just abandoned the territory and left his secretary, territorial secretary, in charge. That was Daniel Woodson, who was pro-slavery. Woodson was more decisive. He tried to get the military involved. But there's no state militia because it wasn't a state yet. So like the National Guard, there was none because it didn't exist. And also, since it wasn't a state, the federal troops weren't getting involved because they were divided too. As we'll see what when the Civil War did happen, the military was divided too between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. Anyway, John Brown continued fighting, and he led a vigilante group that fought battles in Blackjack and Osawatomie. Now, some historians retroactively consider all of this to be the first battles in the Civil War. So they would actually, it hasn't caught on. I mean, if you look up the Civil War, they'll say it started in 1861. But more detailed, specialized histories actually consider all of this, the Lawrence and the Siege of Lawrence, followed by the Padawatomi Massacre and all that. They consider that to actually begin the Civil War with justice. I mean, people are killing each other for the same reasons that they were going to be killing each other in the Civil War. Okay, I won't go into all this. By September of 1856, the president finally gets, I guess we should do something. So President Franklin Pierce appointed a new territorial governor, a guy named John Geary. Democrats expected Geary, who was a veteran of the Mexican War, and he had served as a mayor of San Francisco during the gold rush. They expected him to restore order in the territory before the next presidential elections. Geary ordered anyone armed, basically ordered everyone to disarm, both sides, free soilers or slave groups to disarm. And if anyone were caught with arms, they would be assumed to be criminals and treated accordingly. John Brown temporarily left the territory to decide what to do. He certainly was not going to disarm. But he knew now this guy Geary, since he was appointed by the president, presumably would be able to call on federal troops to help him. And Brown's little group was not enough for that. So that's where he conceived the idea, I need more men, but I don't have enough weapons to arm them. So, well, okay, why don't I raid an armory, and an arsenal somewhere, and get more weapons? And then if I have more weapons, then guys, I may have more confidence in this, and then we can invade Kansas again to accomplish the objectives, the free soil objectives. That's what he's thinking about. It's going to take him a while to act on it. Meanwhile, a convention another one met at Lecompton in the summer of 1857. It was pro-slavery again, so it's just back and forth. And there was a dilemma they faced in the context of the presidential election, which ended up electing James Buchanan. But we'll cover that in due course. And all right, yeah, we're going to cover all that later, so I'm going to skip that. In the course of the fighting, on August 30th, 1857, one of John Brown's sons was killed in the fighting, Frederick. John Brown then went on a national tour raising money for the Northern abolitionists, as he wanted to be able to pay troops as well as arm them. And then after he successfully raised money. Next was to get more weapons, and that motivated his attack on the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859. And Brown's men killed 4 people trying to take the arsenal. 10 of his own men were killed. 5 escaped. Another 7 were captured, including John Brown himself. He was put on trial for treason and executed by hanging in Charlestown, West Virginia. Well, it wasn't West Virginia then, but it became West Virginia on December 2nd, 1859. All right, so all that's going on 1854 to 1859. So within that, while Bleeding Kansas is going on, while the Proto-Civil War is going on, emotions are stoked. Emotions are high. October 14th, 1854, another episode of violent anti-Catholicism, which introduces us to a priest, an immigrant priest named Father John Bapst, B-A-P-S-T, born 1815 in Switzerland. At the age of 19, he began studying to become a Jesuit. He was ordained a priest in 1846 at the age of 31. 2 years later, he left Switzerland to serve in the United States. When Father John Bapst set foot in New York, he debarked in the port of New York. Anti-Catholic bigotry, was rampant in the country, as we've already seen. His superiors ordered him first to Old Town, Maine, to minister to the Penobscot Indians, who we met earlier in the course when we were talking about the Acadians. He didn't speak Penobscot, and 10, not 9, 10 priests who had been assigned to the Penobscot had been murdered. And, nobody ever was ever, so it was either Indians or it was Protestants who murdered, but they were all murdered. But nevertheless, he's, okay, this is what the church sent me. So he set about learning Penobscot, the language. And he did well. The Penobscot responded well to him. He started a temperance society. He had been there long enough, and people respected him. There was a rift within the tribe that could have led to violence, but they trusted him as a trustworthy outsider, so he mediated a peace between them. There was a cholera epidemic in Maine, and he stayed at his post, bringing viaticum and the extreme unction to the sick. So he did standard Catholic priest work in 19th century. Then you do your work well, seminarians. This is what you saw. The punishment, will come with more work. So his territory, his jobs were expanded now. Instead of, you continue ministering to the Penobscot, but there are also other people in Maine, other Catholics in Maine. So you also make time, you just to do that too. The Irish immigrants, as well as the descendants of the Canadians, the Canadian Catholics who were on the Maine side of the border. Once the border between Canada and the United States was established. And he did it. In 1850, so he was doing a circuit. By 1850, one of his stops on his circuit was Eastport, and another was Bangor, Maine. In dealing with the European descendants, Catholics, he did standard sacramental life, also formed temperance societies, and was achieving success converting some Protestants to Catholicism. And therein was the trigger for what happened to him. In Ellsworth, Maine, that was one of the stops on his circuit. It's all one word, ELLSWORTH. He had set up a small church and school. Canonically, it was not a parish, because a priest cannot canonically create a parish, but functionally it was a chapel on his stop, and he had a small school there. He was known, he had come to the attention of some of the Protestant ministers in Maine because he was achieving success in converting Protestants. Now, the ones he did achieve success with, the whole family would come in. So numerically, it wasn't that many in terms of the population of the state, but it attracted attention because he would bring the whole family in, and he would do that. It may have only been 5 families, but families were big then, so that could have been like 60 people. But it was just the idea that this guy was bringing whole families in that got him on the anti-Catholic radar. And the match that led to what happened to him went back to the Bible issue. He proposed that Catholic students in Maine be exempt from reading the King James Bible in school, and instead be allowed to read the Douay-Rheims version of the Bible. Basically, what Kenrick had proposed in 1844 that led to burning down churches in Philadelphia. And that triggered the Know Nothings, so that there were Know Nothings in Maine. On July 8th, 1854, they blew up the school, the Catholic school in Ellsworth, and the explosion also shattered the windows of the rectory and church nearby, but the buildings were still standing, so then they set them on fire. Then on October 14th, 1854, they kidnapped him. And this is an account of what happened that ended up in the newspapers. Quote, "They carried him on a sharp rail." So, like the rails of a railroad. So, they like one leg on each side of the rail, if you get the meaning. And then they carried him, bouncing on that. So they carried him on a sharp rail to a lonely place, stripped him naked, bound him to a tree, smeared him with tar and feathers. They then piled brush around him and attempted to set it on fire. but their matches gave out. The sheriff finally arrived on the scene and dispersed the mob at the point of a pistol." End quote. The Attorney General of Maine made a pretense of investigating, but no charges were filed. So kidnap and torture this guy, and attempted murder, as well as the arson, setting off explosives, burning down, no charges were filed. He recovered. It took him a while, but he recovered. He stayed in Bangor, Maine. Can you believe that? He stayed in Maine for 5 more years. And he established a new parish. In 1855, laid the cornerstone for St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church. And that building is now on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1859, he was transferred. He went to Massachusetts. He became chaplain of the College of Holy Cross in Worcester. A year later, he was transferred to Boston. He was appointed to the scholasticate at Boston College. And in 1863, he was appointed president of Boston College. He stayed there until 1869. By 1877, he was in Providence, Rhode Island. He was serving at St. Joseph's Church there. The bishop had hoped that Baptist would establish a college in Rhode Island, as like Boston College in Boston. But by this point, something's happened to him, and those who knew him attributed. He said well, they didn't use this term then because it's 1870s, but we would say post-traumatic stress disorder. That it was starting to come back to him, and it was trauma. I mean, so they didn't use the PTSD, but all of his colleagues were certain that it had come back to haunt him. What happened to him? He started suffering intense nightmares. He would wake up literally screaming in the night. And then other Jesuits in the house that would go, what's wrong? And so the nightmares were that they were coming to get him, that they were coming through the windows to get him, to finish the job. And he really never, he disintegrated mentally and emotionally. He just disintegrated after this. It was really sad. Until he died. He died on November 2nd, 1887 at Mount Hope, Maryland. So that's, one of many. And that's just, we only know about it because it made the news. But how many priests, they just took him somewhere, cut their throat, and left him in the woods and said, "Oh, where'd Father? Oh, we don't know." And they never found the body, The next year, another outbreak of anti-Catholicism brings us back to Cincinnati, Ohio. The Cincinnati riots, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, occurred from April 2nd through April 7th, 1855. These were clashes between nativists, know-nothings, against German American Catholics, driven by both anti-Catholicism as well as anti-immigration ethnic hatred. The officially rebranded, like the know-nothings, when they did publicly congregate, they created a political party called the American Party. I think we talked about that previously. They supported James D. Taylor in the election for mayor of Cincinnati. This guy was the editor of a newspaper, the Cincinnati Times, had a long record of public denunciation of Catholicism and immigration. Street fighting erupted on Election Day, April 2nd, 1855. Now keep the context in mind. Bleeding Kansas is going on right now at this time. Bleeding Kansas, there was open warfare in the territory between 1854 and 1859. So this is in 1855. So right when all that's in the news, and they were fighting over the same stuff in Kansas. It was elections. So it was not like, again, nothing just happens. This didn't just happen. There was a context. So street fighting erupted in Cincinnati on Election Day between the nativist and the German Catholic immigrants. living in what they called, what the Know Nothings call the Over the Rhine neighborhood, referring, over the Rhine. That's where Germany is in Europe. So that's, like Little Germany. That's essentially what they were calling it. So the following day, April 3rd, a Know Nothing mob invaded the neighborhood, the Over the Rhine neighborhood. It was a full-scale battle. Several people died, and the ballots from two of the wards, two of the polling places in the German neighborhood were burned before being counted. The Germans then organized their own informal militia, the Road Vigilante Group, and they constructed barricades across Vine Street to defend their neighborhood. Grasping for a means of restoring peace, state officials in Cincinnati intervened and declared that the American Party candidate, the Know Nothing, James Taylor, lost, and that the Democratic candidate won. The new Republican Party, established just the year earlier in 1854, used the subsequent the bitterness and over this and the loss of the Know Nothings felt the election was stolen from us, then so the Republicans recruited members of the American Party, because of their bitterness over this. Same year, 1855, Louisville, Kentucky. The Bloody Monday riots, August 6th, 1855. August 5th and 6th. It started on August 5th, 1855. The anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant hysteria spread to Kentucky. There was fighting, in the course of which 22 German Catholics and Irish Catholics, immigrants, were killed. And again, this, Bleeding Kansas is going on. So it's like that kind of legitimized, well, not morally legitimized, but it just, it's like it was not an outrage now to see. It was not, oh, wow, where did this come from? To have public street battles over voting because of what was going on in Kansas. As the Whig Party collapsed. So remember that there were the Federalists with the strong central government types. That collapsed as a result of the corrupt bargain election, which elected John Quincy Adams. Then Henry Clay of Kentucky reformulated their ideology as the Whig Party. Well, Henry Clay died in 1852, so the Whig Party sort of collapsed without him as the central the central mind and the central public face. And the issue of slavery continued to divide the Whigs. And so there were many Whigs who were looking for a new party. And many Democrats felt the same way. Like there were Northern Democrats who, even though they believed in states' rights, they thought slavery was not worth retaining. So they were fatigued with the constant controversy over slavery that was dividing their party based on North-South affiliation. So both sets of wandering, disaffected, but nevertheless politically activated people, from the Whigs, from the Democrats, gravitated to the Know Nothings, to the American Party, or to the Republican Party. Those who went to the American Party were those who were more overtly anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. They saw that as nationalistic and patriotic. So the American Party, the Know Nothings, had much more success in local elections than they did in national elections. For example, they won victories in Jefferson County, Kentucky, in August of 1854. Then on April 7th of 55, John Barbee, Barbee, he won running as on the American Party, running as a Know Nothing. He won. He became mayor of Louisville. As the point of unity in these elections in Kentucky was hatred. hatred of immigrants, hatred of Catholics, violence was inevitable. On July 8th, 1855, all right, so the election was April, so 5 months later, a mob gathered around a Catholic church on 5th Street in Louisville. A rumor circulated that the Irish Catholics, had stockpiled weapons in the church, and they were preparing to use them in the upcoming state elections. So the local and municipal elections already happened, and the American Party won. So the rumor was, okay, the Catholics are going to fear that the American Party, the Know Nothings, will take over the state. So they're stockpiling weapons, and then they're going to attack to interfere and sabotage the election. Just as the fighting going on in Kansas. So you see that's what's in people's minds. They're thinking, okay, this is just the way elections are going to be handled now. A few days later, the Louisville Public School Board fired all the Catholic teachers in the public schools. The newspapers, seeing them as a threat, seeing them as a public threat. The newspapers, such as the Louisville Democrat and the Louisville Daily Journal, attacked each other, on both sides to fan the flames. The Daily Journal, portrayed the Democrats as the destroyers of the Union, and the American Party as the only true savior of the nation. And the editor, this is George Prentice, would say, to constantly denounce the foreign hordes, especially the Catholic part of the foreign hordes. He stated that the Pope sought to rule this country, whereas the Louisville Democrat, struck back, saying that the Know-Nothings were the worst class of voters because of their propensity to violence and hate. On the day before the August elections, meaning the statewide elections, Prentice published the following advertisement, quote, "Let the foreigners keep their elbows to themselves today at the polls. Americans, are you ready? We think we hear you shout, 'Ready!' We'll fire, and may heaven have mercy on the foe." Just before the election, the Know-Nothings held a torchlight procession through the streets of Louisville, numbers estimated to be 1,500. They did this hoping to intimidate the foreigners, meaning the Irish and the German Catholics, into staying home and not coming out to vote. At midnight, the Know-Nothings took control of the polls. Well, not all the polls in the state, but in Louisville, they took control of the polling stations, and there was a pitched battle against the police, the Louisville police, to liberate the polls. So on August, and the police won that. So on August 6th, 1855, the polling stations opened at 6 a.m. and remained open to 7 p.m. Most of the polling stations had thugs at the door asking for a yellow ticket, which was a sign for the Know-Nothing Party, and asked foreigners, based on their accent, if they had their naturalization papers to prove that they were citizens. So the police did not stop this because they were not doing it inside of the buildings. It was people approaching that they were doing this. And again, it's just, standard intimidation tactics. But there was fighting involved. And, they did not have, large contingents of police at every single polling station. So in the court, one German guy named George Berg, he refused. He told the thugs at the door, "I don't have to tell you anything. I don't have to show you any papers. I don't have to tell you if I'm a citizen or not." He was just hanging outside. I mean, he doesn't have any official. So they beat him to death. They just grabbed him, carried him out back, and just beat him to death. News of this spread. I mean, it was seen, and the news of this spread. His body was found. So a riot took place. A riot began in the German district at 4 p.m., which was on the east end of Louisville. Took place in the First Ward, which was in the east end of Louisville. Another riot erupted 2 hours later at 6 p.m. in the Irish district, which is in the western side of town. On the corner of Shelby and Green Streets, somebody started firing at passing carriages. Another man was shot while riding in his own buggy. Once gunshots were heard, then everything just became uncontrollable. So it's okay, it's Kansas again. The bishop of the city was Bishop Martin Spalding. He would later end up as Archbishop of Baltimore, but at this point, he's Bishop of Louisville. He gave the keys of the Cathedral of the Assumption to the mayor, hoping that we're protected. So when the mob arrived at the cathedral, saying, "Oh, we know weapons are being stored there," the mayor opened the church and allowed representatives of the crowd to search inside to see that there were no weapons. Then he relocked the church. The mob then moved on to St. Martin's Church on Shelby Street, believing, okay, well, the weapons must be there. Again, the mayor assured, said it's searched, there's no weapons here. So the mob started to grow. Another 50 men carrying muskets, armed with bayonets, and pulling a cannon. Remember, we saw this happen. This happened earlier, in Philadelphia with other riots, which means somebody in the militia or the military was involved, or at least looked the other way to let these people get a cannon. By 3 p.m., so now we're into the next day, the mob assembled around a brewery, Armbruster's Brewery, which was, German, of course, and they burned it down because, it was foreign. It was owned by foreigners. The Irish ward, the Irish side of the city, then, fighting broke out at one of their own, a guy named Theodore Rhodes. He and 2 other men were beaten to death in the same circumstances, but there was a different polling place. And the know-nothing thugs outside were demanding, well, where's your yellow, slip that we gave out at the meetings? And the Irish said, well, they said something that I cannot repeat on a family-friendly station. But just basically said the same thing that George Burke said on the other side of the city. It's not your business. I don't have to tell you anything. So they beat him to death, along with 2 of his friends. So 3 of the Irish beaten to death. So then a battle. Now, there's a German side of the city, a full-scale battle. Now on the other side of the Irish side of the city, full-scale battle. So the Know-Nothings burned down a whole, row houses, a whole row of row houses, like a whole, there were 12 houses. These, the row houses there, I guess we call them townhouses down here, where, they're 2 or 3 stories, some cases 4 stories, but they share a wall, like they're different houses. Like you can't go from one to the other inside. They all have exterior entrances. But, there's one on a corner, then it shares a wall with the next one. That shares a wall with the next, so that's the row houses. So you burn one, and then, the fire's going to spread. So it took out a whole block, which turned out to be 12 homes. And there were several people who died, burned to death, because they couldn't get out. Fighting escalated, and the Irish retaliated, tried to get the capture the arsonist, but the Know-Nothings had the numbers. So then they dragged a couple of the Irish that they captured and hung them from a banister on a bridge. It was just total chaos. Fires burned, the city. I mean, the entire city didn't burn down, but there were fires, all over Louisville. All right, so go on and on. No, skip all this. A priest, Father Karl Buswald, he was a German immigrant. He was a pastor of the Church of the Immaculate Conception on the corner of 8th and Cedar. One of his parishioners, German, Catholic immigrant, was beaten badly, and he was dying. So the family, he wanted last rites. So the priest went out, despite the rioting, went to go give this guy last rites. He was caught. He was caught by the Know-Nothings, and they beat him to death. In his case, he was stoned. And it went on. They attacked the courthouse, and so then it just became complete anarchy. And so it had to be suppressed by the military. Once again, the police were overwhelmed, so the military had to come in. In this case, the Kentucky militia, state militia, had to go in. And after this, in June of 1850, there was investigation, of course, and all this sort went on and on, resulting in June of 1857, the Know Nothings, the American, that were disbanded officially. The American Party was disbanded in Kentucky, meaning that they were not going to be issued any licenses or any what do they call it? Permits for public functions. And the riots, I mean, this did tarnish the reputation of the Know Nothings, along with what was going on in Kansas. While Bleeding Kansas was going on, May 22nd, well, it was May 19th through May 22nd, 1856, violence in the Senate, the U.S. Senate. So violence in the 1850s was not confined to these open street battles. On May 19th, 1856, in the old Senate chamber, at 1 p.m., the freshman senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, Sumner, rose to speak. It had taken him 2 months to schedule the floor time that he wanted. He was a crusading anti-slavery Republican. He intended to address the ongoing issue of Kansas, whether Kansas should be admitted to the Union as a slave state or a free state. As now, as we saw, Kansas, they were in the territorial process, and both sides had elected territorial legislatures and territorial governors, and they each had territorial capitals. And so which one was Congress going to accept? Were they going to accept the first one, which had written up the slave code, making Kansas a slave state, or were they going to accept the other, which was the Free Soilers, and meaning Kansas would be a free state? So he was addressing that issue, and obviously he was, on the side of Kansas being free. He had written out everything, his entire address, in longhand, and he arranged in advance for a printed edition in pamphlet form, which in printed form was 112 pages. By the time he entered the chamber on May 19th, he had memorized every word. And the title of the pamphlet, the title of the address was The Crime Against Kansas. He spoke for 5 hours over 2 days, in the course of which he singled out 2 Democratic senators as principal culprits in the crime against Kansas, at which he blamed on supporters of slavery. And so first he blamed Stephen Douglass, the senator from Illinois, the one who had moved the first Kansas Nebraska Act. Sumner, in the speech, described Douglass as, quote, a brutal, vulgar man without delicacy or scholarship, who looks as if he needs clean linen and should be put under a shower bath. Turning to Douglass, Douglass was a senator too, who was in the chamber. Then he turned to him and pointed and described him as a noisome, squat, nameless animal, not a proper model for an American senator. He then focused on Andrew Butler, who was a senator, but he was not in the chamber that day. Is a senator from South Carolina, who said publicly, quote, that he took a mistress who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. In the other chamber of Congress, the House of Representatives, there was a member named Preston Brooks. He was related to Senator Andrew Butler. Now, if Brooks had regarded Sumner as a gentleman, he would have challenged him to a duel. But he did not regard Sumner as a gentleman. So instead, he selected a cane for his trip to the Capitol. Shortly after the Senate adjourned, 3 days later, on May 22nd, 1856, Brooks entered the Senate chambers where he found Sumner still at his desk. He was actually putting stamps on his pamphlet copies of his speech to mail out. So Brooks ambushed him. He slammed the metal-topped cane onto Sumner's head. And Brooks just started repeatedly, slamming him with the cane. Sumner rose, lurched around, disoriented, trying to protect himself, bleeding profusely, but eventually was inert on the ground, had to be carried away. After which Brooks walked calmly out of the chamber, and he was not detained by any of the stunned onlookers. Overnight, both men became heroes in their respective regions, with their heroism fueled by the respective newspapers. Brooks was subject to a resolution in the House, a censure resolution, which failed because all the Southerners supported him. Brooks resigned. Then there was a special election, and he was immediately reelected. So then he could say, well, his constituents supported him too. Sumner recovered slowly, given the state of medical care of the day, but he eventually did return to the Senate, where he remained for another 18 years. The nation, suffering from a complete breakdown of public order now in multiple states, as well as in the capital. This event, even though nobody died compared to what was going on in Kansas and Kentucky and Baltimore, that it's like, okay, it's falling apart. The Republic is falling apart. The universal outrage over the Kansas Nebraska Act, as well as all of it, in elections during the Bleeding Kansas period between 1854 and 1858, the Know Nothings, the American Party, managed to win elections for governor of 8 states, mayors of Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Louisville, as well as 100 congressmen into the federal Congress, and thousands of local officials, people on school boards, city councils, etc. Let's see. Okay. We'll stop here and then pick up, moving in 1856, another round of riots, this time in Baltimore, September and November 1856. Some more anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant riots. So for now, we will pause. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.